I received this account from a follower named Fernando, who works as a maintenance technician in the Buenos Aires subway. What he found in an abandoned tunnel during an emergency repair made him resign after 15 years in the same position. If you have ever worked in underground tunnels or places below ground and felt that there are sections where you simply shouldn't be, share it below. This is Fernando's story and what he discovered in the forgotten depths of the subway. My name is Fernando, and for 15 years I worked as a maintenance technician in the Buenos Aires subway system. It was a stable job, well paid, with good benefits. I knew every tunnel, every abandoned station, every corner of the underground maze that extends beneath the city. Or at least I thought I did. What I am going to tell happened 4 months ago, during the night shift on April 13th. That night changed everything I thought I knew about the subway, about Buenos Aires, and about what really exists beneath our feet. The Buenos Aires subway has over 100 years of history. Line A, the first, opened in 1913, but what many don't know is that there are entire sections that have been closed, sealed, forgotten. Tunnels that were excavated but never used, stations that were planned but never completed. A ghost world beneath the real world. As a night maintenance technician, my job was to respond to emergencies when the train stopped running between 1 and 5 in the morning. That night, I received a call about an electrical problem on Line A, between the Peru and Piedras stations. Something was interfering with the systems, causing intermittent blackouts. I took my equipment and went down to the tunnel. My partner that night was Gabriel, a young guy who had only been on the job for 6 months. We walked through the main tunnel with our flashlights, following the cables until we found the point where the readings showed the anomaly. "It's around here," I said, checking my meter. "There's a massive voltage drop, as if something is draining energy from the system." Gabriel illuminated the walls of the tunnel. "Do you see that?" I followed his light. On the tunnel wall, almost hidden behind decades of grime, there was a metal door. It wasn't on any of the plans I knew. "Strange," I murmured. "I've never seen this door before." We approached. The door was old, the metal rusted and covered with a greenish patina. But the strangest thing was that it was slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it recently. And from the opening came a smell. Damp earth mixed with something sweet and rotten. "Should we check inside?" Gabriel asked, his voice betraying nervousness. "We need to find the source of the electrical problem," I replied, "and my readings indicate it comes from there." I pushed the door, which creaked open, echoing in the tunnel. Behind it was a staircase descending deeper, carved into the living rock. The walls were damp, covered in moss and fungi that glowed faintly in the darkness. "This isn't on any official plans," I said. "It must be from when they were doing the original excavations, probably an exploratory tunnel that was never used." We began to descend. The stairs were steep and uneven, clearly not made for regular use. The air grew denser, harder to breathe with each step, and the smell worsened. After what seemed like 100 steps, we arrived at a horizontal tunnel. It was different from the subway tunnels. This one was older, the walls were not modern concrete but ancient stone, and the construction techniques seemed from another era. The 19th century, perhaps earlier. "Fernando, I don't like this," Gabriel said. "We should go back and report it." But my professional curiosity was already activated. "Just a little further. I need to see where that energy drop is coming from." The tunnel extended straight ahead, gradually descending. The walls were marked with symbols I didn't recognize. They were not modern graffiti. They were ancient carvings, worn by time but still visible. Some seemed religious, crosses and stars. Others were stranger, impossible geometries that made your eyes hurt to look at them. After walking about 200 meters, the tunnel opened into a large chamber. It was a circular area, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling. And in the center, there was something that made both Gabriel and me stop dead in our tracks. It was a structure. It looked like an altar or a monument, built with stones that did not match anything in the local geology. Black polished stones arranged in a circular pattern, and in the center of the circle, suspended in a way I couldn't understand, there was a shining object. It appeared to be made of metal, perhaps gold or bronze, in the shape of an irregular sphere covered in inscriptions. And it pulsed with its own light, a sickly bluish glow that faintly illuminated the chamber. "What the hell is that?" Gabriel whispered. I approached cautiously, my electric meter in hand. The readings went crazy. The object was emitting some kind of intense electromagnetic field. That explained the electrical interference in the subway above. It's some kind of artifact, I said, but I don't know what era or purpose. Around the chamber there were other objects. Rotten wooden boxes that crumbled at the touch. Rolled up scrolls that turned to dust when I tried to touch them. And bones. Many bones. Human, scattered around the altar as if they had been deliberately left there. Fernando, we need to leave. Now, Gabriel said urgently. But before I could respond, we heard something. A sound coming from deeper in the chamber, from a tunnel we hadn't noticed before, hidden in the shadows. Footsteps, slow, dragging, approaching. Our flashlights turned toward the sound. And what we saw emerging from that dark tunnel made my blood run cold. It was a humanoid figure, but completely wrong. It moved on 4 legs, but its limbs were bent at angles that no human joint would allow. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, showing dark veins underneath. And its head was turned backward, looking at where it had been instead of where it was going. When it spoke, its voice was multiple, as if several people were speaking at the same time in different tones. Intruders, invaders of the sanctuary, you must stay. Gabriel and I recoiled, our backs hitting the altar. The creature continued to approach, moving with a horrible grace that defied all physical logic. What is that? I managed to ask, my voice barely working. Guardian, the thing replied. Protector of the sacred, custodian of the seals. They have come. Now you must stay. Other shapes began to emerge from the surrounding tunnels. More creatures like the first. 5, 10, 20 of them, all moving with that same unnatural shape. And as they approached, they sang something in a language I didn't recognize, words that sounded like bones breaking and metal scraping stone. Run! I shouted to Gabriel. We ran towards the stairs we had come down. The creatures followed us, but they were slow, clumsy in their movements despite their agile appearance. We stumbled up the stairs, our flashlights swinging wildly, casting crazy shadows on the walls. Behind us, the singing continued, growing in volume and intensity. And I felt something else. A pressure in my mind, as if something were trying to invade my thoughts, planting ideas that weren't mine. We reached the subway tunnel and ran towards the nearest station. We didn't stop until we were on the surface, gasping under the streetlights at 3 in the morning. What was that? Gabriel breathed heavily, his eyes wild with terror. I don't know, I said. But we need to report it. There's something down there. Something that shouldn't exist. But when we tried to report what we had seen to our supervisor, they looked at us as if we were crazy. They said there were no unmapped tunnels in that section, that the door we described didn't exist, that we had obviously been exposed to toxic gases in the tunnels and had shared hallucinations. They sent us for a medical evaluation. The doctors found nothing wrong except elevated stress levels. They gave us a few days off and told us to come back when we were recovered. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't leave it at that. During my free time, I investigated. I searched through historical archives, old libraries, anything that could explain what lay beneath the subway. What I found was disturbing. It turns out that Buenos Aires was built over what was once a network of natural and artificial tunnels. Some dated back to the colonial era, used by smugglers and the church. Others were even older, created by pre-Columbian indigenous cultures. And I found references to something called the Sanctuary of the Eternals. According to fragmented documents from the 18th century, it was a place where a secret society performed forbidden rituals. Rituals designed to preserve life beyond natural death, to create immortal guardians who would protect their secrets forever. The society was eventually persecuted by the Inquisition and colonial authorities. Its members were executed, but before their capture, they sealed their sanctuary, leaving behind the guardians, people who had been transformed by the rituals into something more and less than human. The documents were vague, probably deliberately so, but they mentioned that the sanctuary was never found, that it remained hidden beneath the city, waiting, and they warned that it should never be opened, that what had been sealed there must remain sealed forever. When I returned to work a week later, I asked my supervisor to show me the plans for that section of the tunnel. We went together, and I pointed out exactly where the metal door had been. There was nothing. The wall was solid, without marks, without signs that there had ever been an opening there. But when I touched the wall, I felt something, a faint pulse, like a very weak heartbeat emanating from behind the concrete. "See?" said my supervisor. "There's nothing here. You had a gas-induced hallucination. It happened sometimes in the old tunnels." But I knew the truth. Someone had sealed that door again. Or maybe it had never been open in our normal world. Maybe Gabriel and I had momentarily crossed into something more, a layer of reality that normally remains separate from ours. Gabriel quit 2 days later. He told me he couldn't keep working underground, that every time he closed his eyes he saw those creatures moving in the darkness. The last time I spoke to him, he was planning to move to another country, as far away from Buenos Aires as possible. I tried to carry on. For 3 more months I continued working in the tunnels, but every night I could feel them, the guardians, moving in parallel tunnels just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the lights. And sometimes when the subway was particularly quiet in the early hours of the morning, I could hear that singing. Faint, distant, but unmistakably the same singing we had heard in that chamber. The breaking point came a month ago. I was doing a routine repair when I found marks on a wall of the tunnel. Marks that hadn't been there the previous week. They were symbols, the same symbols I had seen carved into the walls of that ancient tunnel. And beneath the symbols, written in what appeared to be dried blood, there was a message in Spanish. "We found them. We remember them. Soon we will return for what belongs to us." I quit that very night. I didn't wait for the notice period. I simply left my gear, exited the subway, and never returned. Now I work above ground, in an office building doing maintenance on air conditioning systems. It's boring, it's safe, and most importantly, it's in the sunlight. But sometimes when I'm alone in the basement of some building, checking generators or electrical systems, I hear something, a distant scratching, a whisper of multiple voices speaking in that impossible language. And it reminds me that what I found was not confined only to that chamber beneath the subway. It is beneath the entire city, a network of ancient tunnels, of secret societies, of forgotten rituals. And the guardians are still there, protecting their secrets, waiting. Buenos Aires is a beautiful city. During the day it is life and light, tango and art, history and culture. But at night, especially in the darkest hours before dawn, if you pay attention, you can hear them. Those who live in the depths, those who were transformed by forbidden rituals and left behind to protect what should never be found. The subway continues to operate normally. Millions of people use it every day, completely unaware of what lies beyond the walls of the tunnels, deeper than the trains ever reach. And maybe it's better this way. Maybe ignorance is a blessing. Because knowing what's down there, knowing that every time you go down to the subway you're passing just meters away from those things, that knowledge changes everything. I can't take the subway anymore. I can't even walk over the ventilation grates without feeling a shiver. Because I know there are eyes in the darkness looking up, deformed hands gripping bars, voices singing in dead languages. And I wonder how many other places like that exist. How many other cities have forgotten sanctuaries beneath their streets. How many other secret societies sealed their rituals and guardians in underground chambers, waiting for the day someone stumbles upon them. The answer, I suspect, is more than we want to know. The shiny object we saw, the one emitting that electromagnetic field. I never discovered what it was, but I've thought about it a lot since then. It was clearly the source of power for something. For the Guardians, to maintain the seal over something even worse? I don't know. What I do know is that the Buenos Aires subway has inexplicable electrical problems in that section several times a year. Technicians go, find some mundane reason, fix it. But the anomalies continue. Because the true source is never addressed. Because it is beyond the reach of modern technology. Beyond what the official plans recognize as existing. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by fleeing. If I should have insisted more on reporting what we found. If I should have forced the authorities to investigate, to permanently seal those tunnels, to destroy whatever is down there. But then I remember the warnings in the historical documents. It must never be opened. What is sealed must remain sealed. And I wonder if by having found it, by having crossed the threshold of that chamber, we have already done enough damage. Because since that night, the electrical problems in the subway have increased. The anomalies are more frequent. And I have heard rumors, whispers among former co-workers, of other technicians who have seen strange things in the tunnels. Shadows moving in incorrect ways. Sounds that shouldn't be there. As if what was sleeping beneath the city had been disturbed. As if the Guardians were more active, more alert, preparing for something. I don't know what will come next. I don't know if the seals that keep those things contained are weakening, or if they are simply becoming bolder. But I know this. There is a world beneath ours. A world of darkness and ancient secrets. And the two realities are separated by membranes thinner than we believe. And sometimes in places like forgotten subway tunnels, those membranes become thin enough to cross, to see what normally remains hidden, to encounter those who guard secrets that modern humanity has forgotten. My advice, if you ever find a door that shouldn't be there, a tunnel that isn't on the blueprints, a chamber that smells of centuries of preserved darkness, don't enter. No matter how curious you are, no matter if it's your job to investigate. Turn your back, close the door if you can, and forget that you ever saw it. Because some mysteries exist for a reason. Some secrets were buried because unearthing them only brings darkness to the world you thought you knew. And once you have seen what lurks in the depths, you can never unsee it. You can never walk the streets of your city again without knowing what moves beneath your feet. You can never forget that civilization is just a thin layer over something much older, much darker. That is the burden I now carry. The knowledge I cannot share because no one would believe me. The certainty that beneath Buenos Aires, beneath the subway that transports millions, there are immortal guardians protecting a sanctuary of forgotten horrors. And they are waiting, always waiting. Thus concludes Fernando's testimony. He told me that moving to surface jobs helped him, but that he still completely avoids the subway system. If you have ever worked in tunnels, deep basements, or underground systems, and have encountered sections that just felt wrong, share it in the comments. Sometimes what we bury beneath our cities includes more than just cables and pipes. Sweet dreams, and we'll talk soon. A few days ago, I received a message that I read several times before deciding to share it. It was sent to me by a woman named Rosa, who lives in a rural town, and took almost 3 years to write it because, in her own words, putting it into text makes it more real. If you have something like that saved, something you haven't been able to tell anyone, write to me. I publish these stories because I believe they deserve to be heard. What Rosa experienced happened when she was young and went to spend the summer at her maternal grandmother's house, in a town where everyone knew each other, and where, as Rosa discovered, everyone knew things that no one spoke aloud. She was 19 years old when she went to spend the summer at her grandmother Petra's house. It was not the first time I had been to the village. As a child, I had gone several times with my parents, but it had been at least 5 years since I last returned. And in that time, I had changed enough to see the place with different eyes. I was no longer the girl who ran through the fields without asking anything. Now I was a young woman who observed, who noticed, who asked questions that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. The village was called Veredas, a strange name for a village, I always thought, as if someone had wanted to name not the place but the paths that led to it. There were about 300 people in winter, perhaps double in summer with those who returned for a visit. White, low houses, a church in the center, a square with 2 stone benches, and an orange tree so old that no one remembered having seen it grow. The kind of place where time passes differently. My grandmother Petra had lived alone since my grandfather had died years ago. She was a small and quiet woman, one of those who don't talk much, but when they do, they always say something worth listening to. She welcomed me with a long hug and a hot soup, and in the first few days, everything was exactly what I expected from that summer. Tranquility, dry heat, long afternoons on the porch, nights that smelled of earth and jasmine. It was in the second week when I started to notice things. The first was the neighbor. My grandmother Petra's house had an empty lot on the right, and another house on the left, separated only by a low dividing wall. The woman who lived there was named Dolores, although everyone in the village simply called her La Lola, with that article in front that in some villages is used with affection and in others with something that is not exactly affection. Lola was about 60 years old. She was tall for being from the village, from that generation, and moved with a particular slowness that did not seem like tiredness but deliberation, as if every movement she made had been considered before being executed. I had seen her a couple of times peeking over her side of the wall, watering her plants, and each time our eyes met, she quickly looked away first, as if looking directly at me was something she preferred to avoid. I asked my grandmother Petra about her one afternoon while we were shelling beans in the kitchen. My grandmother took a moment to respond. Her hands continued working with that automatic efficiency of someone who has shelled beans thousands of times. Lola is Lola, she finally said, which was the kind of answer that didn't answer anything but seemed sufficient in that town. Do you get along? I insisted. We respect each other, my grandmother said, and she changed the subject. That night, from my room that overlooked the side of the house where the party wall was, I heard Lola in her garden. It wasn't unusual for her to be outside at that hour. It was summer, and the heat made the night preferable to the day. But what I heard wasn't the sound of someone watering or sitting quietly. It was a murmur, continuous, low, with that specific rhythm of someone reciting something from memory. Like a prayer, I thought. But it wasn't the rhythm of a prayer that I recognized. It lasted maybe 20 minutes, then silence, and the sound of a door closing. I fell asleep thinking about it. The village market took place on Tuesday mornings in the square. It was small with 4 or 5 stalls, but everyone went because the market was not just a place to buy, but the place where the village informed itself. My grandmother Petra went every week without fail, and that first Tuesday she took me with her. It was there that I met Amparo. Amparo was my age, 19, and she was the granddaughter of one of the men who had a vegetable stall. She had been born in the village but had spent the last few years studying in the city just like me, and that created an immediate kind of common ground between us. We started talking while our grandmothers did their shopping, and by the time the market ended, we had already agreed to meet that afternoon. Amparo knew the town with that intimacy of someone who has grown up in it, but also with the critical distance of someone who has been away long enough to see it from the outside. She explained it to me on the way to the river that afternoon, as we walked along one of those paths through fields that the town had in abundance. Veritas is a strange town, she said without preamble. All small towns are strange, I said. No, listen. She looked at me. This town specifically has things that the others don't have. It has always had them. There are people here who do things that people prefer not to look too closely at. What kind of things? Amparo hesitated. Not like someone who doesn't know what to say, but like someone who knows exactly what to say and is weighing whether to say it. Do you know your grandmother's neighbor? She asked. Lola. I stopped. Yes, I said. I've seen her a couple of times. Has your grandmother told you anything about her? She told me that she is respected. Amparo let out a short laugh without humor. That's exactly what your grandmother would say. She kept walking. Lola has a reputation in the village. Not just now, always. Her mother had it too, and her mother's mother. There are people who go to see her when they have problems they don't know how to solve. And there are people who completely avoid her. And there are people like your grandmother who live next door and simply coexist, carefully. Reputation for what exactly? I asked, although I already had an idea. Amparo looked at me sideways. For knowing things, she said. For being able to do things. For both. That night I asked my grandmother Petra directly. We were in the living room after dinner with the TV on but without sound as she usually left it, and I waited for that comfortable silence that settles between people who know each other well before speaking. Amparo told me things about Lola, I said. My grandmother did not change her expression. She continued looking at the screen. Amparo talks a lot, she said. Is it true what they say about her? Now she did look at me, with that attention of hers that was hard to maintain because it held something inside that I didn't know how to name, something old and precise. In this town, my grandmother Petra said, there are things that exist even if no one names them, and there are things that cease to exist if they are named too much. What Lola does is one of the former. And is that good or bad? My grandmother thought for a moment. It is what it is, she finally said. It has been what it is for generations. Before this town had that name, there was already someone like Lola in it. And as long as the town exists, there will continue to be someone. That is neither good nor bad. It is simply the way this place works. Have you ever asked her for anything? I asked. My grandmother looked at the screen again. Sleep, Rosa, she said. And that was the last time we talked about it directly. It was Amparo who told me more throughout that week, in fragments that she released with the naturalness of someone who has spent a lifetime hearing these things and no longer distinguishes when they are extraordinary. Lola, according to Amparo, was what people in the village called a healer, although that word was too simple and too innocent for what it really implied. Yes, she prepared remedies with plants, and yes, people went to her when the doctor from the nearby village did not provide satisfactory answers. But she also did other things. Some said she could undo evils. Others said she could cast evils, although they always said that in a low voice. She knew ways to intervene in matters that had no visible solution. "Do you believe her?" I asked Amparo one day. She considered the question seriously. "I have seen things," he said. "When I was a girl, the daughter of a neighbor fell very ill. The doctors didn't know what it was. The family went to see Lola. A week later, the girl was fine." He paused. "It could have had a natural explanation. It probably did. But there are also other things I saw that have no natural explanation. So I don't know if I believe her exactly. What I know is that it doesn't seem wise to not believe her." It was a fine distinction, but I understood it perfectly. The event that changed everything happened on a Thursday night towards the end of the third week. My grandmother Petra had gone to bed early because she had a headache. I stayed in the living room reading late, with the window open to the night heat and the sound of crickets outside filling the silence. It was one of those perfect summer nights that make the world seem calm and whole. Around 11:30, I heard footsteps on the street. It wasn't unusual. Although the town was small, there were people who went out for walks at night to escape the heat. But these footsteps stopped in front of the house. And then I heard a soft knock on the door. Not an urgent or loud knock. 3 discreet taps, with knuckles. I approached the door. I hesitated for a moment. "Who is it?" I said without opening. "It's Lola," said the voice from the other side. "I need to talk to your grandmother." I opened the door. Lola was standing in the doorway with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not exactly fear, because it seemed to me that Lola was not someone who got scared easily. It was something more like the intense worry of someone who has assessed a situation and determined that it requires immediate attention. "My grandmother has a migraine," I said. "She is sleeping." "Wake her up," Lola said. "It's important." There was something in her voice that made me go without questioning it further. I woke up my grandmother Petra. She sat up in bed, looked at me, and by the way she did it, I knew she understood without me saying anything that something had changed. "Lola?" she said. "Yes." My grandmother got up, put on her robe, and went to the living room. I heard them talking from the hallway, not because I was actively eavesdropping, but because the house was small and the voices traveled. I couldn't hear everything, just fragments. Lola spoke in a low and fast voice, and my grandmother responded with monosyllables and short questions. What I did understand was this. Lola had seen something that night at the edge of town, on the road that led to the fields in the east. It wasn't clear to me exactly what she had seen, but the urgency with which she described it was sufficiently eloquent. After about 20 minutes, my grandmother came to the hallway. "Go to your room, Rosa," she said to me. "What's going on?" "Nothing that concerns you tonight." She looked at me. "And don't open the window. Keep it closed until tomorrow." "Grandma." "Rosa." Her voice had that tone that allowed no negotiation. "Go to your room and close the window." I went. I closed the window. I sat on the bed listening. Lola was at the house until after midnight. I heard them moving around. I heard the sound of the kitchen, a smell of something heating up that I didn't recognize. It wasn't any of the things my grandmother normally cooked. And at one moment, briefly, I heard the 2 women reciting something in unison, with that rhythm I had already heard from Lola in her garden, but now clearer and more intentional. Then silence. The door. Lola's footsteps fading down the street, and my grandmother gently knocking on my door. "It's done," she said from outside. "You can sleep peacefully." "What was it?" I asked. A long pause. "Something that had come too close," my grandmother said. "It's gone now. I didn't sleep well that night, but I didn't hear anything else either." The next day, Amparo noticed that I had something different on my face, that expression of someone who has witnessed something they don't know how to classify, and she asked me directly what had happened. I told her everything. The footsteps, the 3 knocks, the conversation I couldn't hear completely, the strange smell from the kitchen, the quiet recitation of the 2 women. Amparo listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "Near the East Road?" she asked. "That's what I understood, yes. That road has history," she said. "The people of the town don't use it at night. They haven't used it for a long time. She looked at me. There's an old story about that road, about something that has frequented it for generations. I don't know if it's true. It's one of those things that are told, and no one knows where they started. But what I know is that people here avoid it at night for very specific reasons. What kind of story, Ame? I asked. Amparo took a while to respond. Someone made a deal on that road a long time ago, he said. Not someone from now, someone from before when the village was much smaller and the things that were in those fields were still more accessible. The deal was to get something, land, harvest, I don't know exactly the details, and what was received in exchange for the deal keeps coming to collect. He paused. That's what they say. And what Lola, and before her, her mother, and before her, her grandmother, takes care of managing. I processed it in silence. Does my grandmother know? I finally said. Your grandmother has been living next to Lola for 70 years, Amparo said. What do you think? I didn't ask my grandmother Petra about that night anymore. She also didn't mention it again. We continued with the summer routine, mornings at the market, afternoons on the porch, nights with the TV on mute, as if nothing had changed. But I had changed the way I looked at things. I started to notice details that I would have ignored before. The specific plants that grew in Lola's garden, some of which I had seen drying in bundles in my grandmother's kitchen without asking her what they were for. The discreet marks on the threshold of my grandmother's door, traced with something that was periodically renewed because the color changed. The way Lola and my grandmother greeted each other when they crossed paths. A brief gesture with the hand that was not exactly a casual greeting but something more coded, more deliberate. A language I understood. A language between people who shared knowledge that was not discussed out loud. The last week of my stay, Lola called me from her side of the dividing wall. I was in the garden, watering my grandmother's plants while she rested, and Lola's voice reached me calm and direct. Rosa. I approached the wall. Lola was standing on the other side, with that way of hers of being completely still, like something that doesn't need to move to show that it is present. Yes, I said. She looked at me for a moment, with that direct gaze she had avoided in the first weeks. Now she didn't avoid it. You have your grandmother's eyes, she said. Not your mother's. Your grandmother's. I didn't know how to respond. It was a strange observation, but there was something in the way she said it that suggested it wasn't a comment about physical resemblance. Your grandmother is a good woman, Lola continued. She has been a good neighbor. She has understood what needs to be understood, and has left in peace what needs to be left in peace. Not everyone knows how to do that. What needs to be understood, I asked. Lola held my gaze. There are things that have been here longer than us, she said, and that will be here longer than our grandchildren. And the way to live with that is not to ignore it or confront it. It's knowing when to act and when to stay still. She paused. You have that, she said. I've seen it since you arrived. And without further ado, she returned to her plants. That night I told my grandmother Petra. I told her exactly what Lola had said to me, word for word. My grandmother listened to me, and when I finished, for the first time that entire summer, she looked at me with an expression that was not the usual one, not the practical and silent woman. It was something more open, something that resembled, if I'm not mistaken, relief. Lola doesn't say those things to just anyone, she said. What does it mean? My grandmother thought for a long moment. It means that when I'm not here, she finally said, she's going to need someone, and she believes that someone could be you. The silence that followed was one of those silences that changed the weight of everything within it. I returned to the city in September. I didn't talk about that summer with anyone, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to start. There are experiences that don't have a natural format in everyday language, that require a context that most people don't have, and telling them without that context risks making them sound like something other than what they are. I returned to Veritas the following summer and the next one. Each time I spent more time with Lola, not formally, not as a student with a teacher, but in the natural way that certain things are transmitted, through observation and presence and conversation that doesn't always seem like conversation. I learned about plants. I learned to read certain signs in animal behavior and in climate changes that were not related to meteorology. I learned to recognize when the eastern path should be avoided and when it was calm. I learned the greeting gesture that Lola and my grandmother used with each other and what it meant. My grandmother Petra died 2 years ago. She passed away peacefully in her bed in the early morning, in the way that people who have done their job well in life die. When I went to Vereda's for the burial, Lola was waiting for me on the porch of her house. She didn't hug me. That wasn't her style. She just looked at me as I walked past her door. "When you're ready," she said. Nothing more. I understood what she meant. That was 2 years ago. I still don't know if I'm ready, but I keep going back to Vereda's. And the road to the east, for now, remains quiet. Although there are nights when the heat is intense, and the air has that specific smell I've learned to recognize, when I know it won't stay quiet forever, and when that moment comes, I'm going to have to know what to do. That's all I can share for now. That was what Rosa wrote to me. At the end of the message, she added that she continues to go to Vereda's every summer, and that Lola is still there. She didn't give me more details, and the truth is that I don't need them either. There are stories that hold up better with what is not said. If anything Rosa shared feels familiar to you, if you grew up in a place where there were people like Lola, or where certain things were known without being named, I would love for you to leave it in the comments. Those stories also deserve to be told. Take care tonight. We'll hear from each other in the next story. Not long ago, a listener named Isabel wrote to me from Colombia. She told me that what she is about to share happened when she was 28 years old, and that she never sought to be believed. She just needed someone else to know. If you also carry something that you haven't been able to tell anyone, the comments are there. But first, let me tell you what happened to Isabel the night she found the mirror. I was never one to believe in these things. I say this because it matters. Because the kind of person I was before that night is part of the story. I was the type who, when someone shared a paranormal experience at a gathering, would nod politely, but inside I was searching for a logical explanation. Psychology, suggestibility, lack of sleep, the brain filling gaps with what it fears. I had an answer for everything. I was 28 years old. I worked as an administrator in a logistics company, lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of a building that had the neutral charm of 1990s architecture. Everything in my life was orderly, predictable, and completely mine. I liked it that way. The mirror came into my life because of a move. My neighbor from the 4th floor, a lady named Hortensia, whom I greeted in the elevator, but with whom I had never had a long conversation, knocked on my door one Saturday morning with an expression of preemptive apology. "Isabel, I need a favor," she said. "I'm moving next week and I have some things I can't take with me. If you want something, I'll give it to you. If not, I'll take it down to the street." I accompanied her to her apartment out of curiosity more than necessity. She had everything I needed. Hortensia's apartment was already half empty, with stacked boxes and that atmosphere of desolation that spaces have when the objects that inhabited them begin to disappear. In the hallway, leaning against the wall, there was a mirror. It was large, almost 2 meters tall, with a dark wooden frame carved with a design I couldn't identify. Intertwined figures that could be flowers or could be something else, depending on the angle from which you looked. The glass was old, with that slight distortion characteristic of old mirrors that makes the reflection look slightly different from that of a modern mirror. "Where did you get it?" I asked Hortensia. "I bought it at an antique fair years ago," she said. "I never knew exactly how old it is. The seller said it was from the last century, but those sellers say anything. Why don't you take it with you?" Hortensia paused briefly. "It doesn't fit in the new place," she said. "And to be honest, I never really liked it. There's something about it that I can't explain. That should have been enough warning. Instead, I looked in the mirror and thought it would look perfect in the second room of my apartment, the one I used as a studio. I brought it up that same afternoon with the help of the doorman. I leaned it against the back wall of the studio in front of the desk and looked at it from the door. It looked good. It added depth to the room, that effect that large mirrors have of making a space seem larger. I thought it was a fortunate acquisition. That night, nothing happened. Neither the next one, nor the one that followed it. For almost 2 weeks the mirror was there and I ignored it with the indifference one has towards decorative objects that have already integrated into the space. I would catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye when passing through the study, nothing more. It was in the 3rd week when I noticed the first thing. I was working from home some days, and that Thursday I was in the study with the laptop open, reviewing reports. At some point, I lifted my eyes from the screen, as one does mechanically after staring at text for a long time, and looked at the mirror. My reflection met my gaze, which is completely normal. That's what mirrors do. Except that my reflection took a second longer than it should have to make the same movement I did. It was so small, so brief, that I dismissed it immediately. A fraction of a second. The kind of optical illusion that fatigue or distraction produces. I continued with the report and didn't think about it anymore. But the next day it happened again. This time I saw it more clearly. I lifted my gaze to the mirror, and my reflection, my image in the old glass, took a noticeable moment before looking up as well. Not much, not enough for anyone else to have certainly noticed. But I saw it. I got up from the chair and stood in front of the mirror. I moved. I raised my right arm. The reflection raised it at the same time, exactly synchronized. I turned my head, synchronized. I smiled, synchronized. I stared at my own image for a moment, looking for any sign of desynchronization. There was none. The reflection was perfect, timely, exact. I decided it had been my imagination and went back to work. That night, before going to bed, I passed by the study to turn off the light I had left on. From the door, without entering, I looked at the mirror. The room was dark except for the light from the hallway coming in where I was standing. The mirror reflected the room, the desk, the window with the blinds closed, and in the center, my figure outlined against the light from the hallway. I turned off the light and closed the door. But just before the door finished closing, in the last moment I had vision of the mirror, I saw that my reflection did not move when I moved. I stood still in the hallway with my hand on the handle of the closed door. My heart was beating faster than normal. I suddenly opened the door and turned on the light. The mirror reflected me entering the room, turning on the light, looking at it. Everything synchronized. Everything normal. I stood in front of it for several minutes, moving in different ways, looking for any discrepancies. There were none. I went to sleep telling myself it was lack of sleep, that I had been working too much for weeks, that the human eye is notoriously unreliable when tired. I believed it enough to sleep. I called my friend Carmen the next day, not to tell her about the mirror, at least not directly. I asked her, with as much naturalness as I could, if she knew anything about antique mirrors, and if it was true that old glass sometimes produced distortions in the reflection. Carmen is an interior designer and knows about these things. The mirrors with antique glass can indeed have imperfections, she said. The mercury they used before as backing deteriorates over time and creates areas where reflectivity is not uniform. It can produce strange visual effects, like a delay in movement. Carmen paused. What kind of delay? As if the reflection took a little longer to make the same movement. Another silence. That's not an imperfection of the glass, Isabel, she said. It doesn't work that way. I know, I said. It was just a theoretical question. Carmen didn't respond immediately. Do you want me to go see that mirror? No, I said. It's nothing, thank you. I hung up and sat in the living room looking at the closed door of the studio. That afternoon, I entered the studio intending to keep working and to ignore the mirror with the determination of someone who has decided not to feed an illusion. I sat at the desk, opened the laptop, and worked for almost an hour without looking in the mirror even once. It was the concentration that made me let my guard down. When one truly works, absorbed in something, the awareness of the surroundings fades away. You spend 40 minutes reading a document and suddenly look up for no particular reason and find yourself staring at something you weren't expecting to see. I lifted my eyes from the screen and looked at the mirror. In the reflection, the room was the same. The desk, the lamp, the window with the blinds half open, me sitting in front of the laptop. But in the reflection, the study door was open. The real door, the one behind me, I had closed when I entered. I remembered it clearly because I always do it, out of habit. I turned to check. The door was closed. I turned back to the mirror. In the reflection, the door was still open. And in the frame of that reflected door, there was a figure. It was not a clear figure. It was more like a density in the darkness of the reflected hallway. An area where the shadow had more presence than the rest, with a shape that was vaguely that of something upright. I couldn't see details. It was just a dark shape in a threshold that in reality was closed. I turned again towards the real door. Closed. The hallway on the other side silent. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was no longer there. The reflected door remained open, but the doorway was empty. I got up from the chair, took the mirror by the frame, and turned it to face the wall. I slept with the hallway light on that night. The next morning, I called Hortensia. It took me a moment to get her number, which I had saved on my phone when we crossed paths and had never used beyond the occasional building message. I dialed several times before she answered. I told her what I had seen. I did it with as much objectivity as I could, describing it as if it were a technical phenomenon that I wanted her to explain to me. Hortensia listened in silence. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Isabel," she finally said, "there's a reason I didn't take that mirror. You told me it didn't fit in the new place. I lied to you, or at least I didn't tell you everything. The truth is that I bought that mirror without knowing what I was buying, and when I started to understand that something was wrong with it, I already had it in my house. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it, and because as long as I didn't use it directly, as long as I kept it covered, it seemed harmless." "Covered?" "I always had it with a cloth over it," Hortensia said. "In my apartment. What I didn't tell you when I offered it to you is that the cloth should have stayed." "What is that mirror, Hortensia?" Another pause. "The seller at the fair told me something when I bought it that at the time seemed just like a sales pitch. That the mirror had belonged to a family that used it for certain practices. That the glass had been prepared in a particular way. I didn't understand well what he meant until I started to notice things." "What things?" "The same ones you describe," he said. "The reflection that doesn't synchronize. The differences between what is in the room and what the glass shows. And once, just once, I saw something in it that wasn't me." "What did you see?" Hortensia took a while to respond. "I saw my mother," she said. "My mother died 12 years ago. I saw her in the mirror, standing behind me, looking at me. When I turned around, there was no one. When I looked back at the mirror, she was still there. And she was looking at me with an expression that my mother never had in life. That didn't correspond to her." The silence that followed was long. "Cover it up," Hortensia finally said. "Cover it up and take it out of the apartment. Don't give it away, don't sell it. Throw it away." "Why didn't you tell me this before giving it to me?" "Because I hoped nothing would happen," she said. "Because with you, I had only lived 4 years in the same building without anything ever happening. I thought maybe it was something personal, something related to me specifically. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Isabel." I hung up the phone and went straight to the studio. The mirror was turned towards the wall, just as I had left it the night before. I left it that way. I searched for a sheet in the hallway closet, the thickest one I had, and covered the mirror with it, making sure that no part of the glass was exposed. Then I sat in the living room and spent a long time doing nothing, processing. What Hortensia had described, what I had seen, had no place in the version of reality I had built in 28 years of rational and skeptical life. And yet it was there, concrete and impossible to ignore. That night I slept in the living room, on the sofa, with all the lights on. I didn't sleep well, but I slept, and nothing happened. The next day I asked the doorman for help to take the mirror down to the building's basement, which was where things that neighbors were going to discard were left. The doorman was named Mr. Armando, and he was an older man who didn't ask unnecessary questions, a quality I deeply appreciated at that moment. We took the mirror down covered with the sheet. Mr. Armando placed it against the basement wall without saying a word. "Mr. Armando," I said to him before going back up, "that mirror is going to the trash. If the large furniture collection truck comes, let them take it." "Understood," he said. I went up to the apartment and closed the door. During the following days I was waiting for something. I didn't know exactly what. Some continuation of what had begun, some sign that taking the mirror out of the study hadn't been enough. I checked the corners of the rooms without really knowing what I was looking for. I avoided looking at the other mirrors in the apartment, the one in the bathroom and the small one in the hallway, for longer than necessary. Nothing happened. A week later, the truck came and took everything that was in the basement. Don Armando confirmed it to me when I ran into him in the elevator. I slept well that night for the first time since the mirror had arrived in my apartment. But this is where the story gets complicated. 3 weeks later, Carmen came to visit me. We had coffee in the living room, and at some point, she went to the bathroom. She took longer than she normally did. When she came out, her expression was different. "Isabel," she said, "how long has that mirror been in your bathroom?" It's always been there, I said. I bought it when I moved in. Have you checked it lately? Checked it how? Carmen looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Go look at yourself in it, she said. I went to the bathroom. I stood in front of the small mirror above the sink. I looked at myself. My reflection looked back at me. What am I supposed to see? I yelled to Carmen from the bathroom. Stay still for a moment, she said from the living room. I stayed still. I looked at myself. The reflection, still too. Everything normal. Then, without me doing anything, my reflection smiled. Just for a moment. A brief curvature of the lips that did not correspond to any movement I had made. So fast that if Carmen hadn't prepared me to be attentive, if I hadn't been looking with that specific concentration, I wouldn't have seen her. I left the bathroom. Did you see it? Carmen asked. Yes, I said. Carmen had the phone in her hand. I have a friend who knows about these things, she said. I'll call her now. Carmen's friend's name was Lucia. She came that same afternoon, a woman in her 50s, discreet, with a way of moving around the apartment that reminded me of someone reading something that others couldn't see. She entered the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror for a while, and came out without saying anything yet. She went to each room, to the study where the large mirror was no longer there, but where Lucia paused for a moment in the spot where it had been leaning against the wall, to the kitchen, to the hallway. Finally, she sat in the living room with Carmen and me. The large mirror you took, she said, had been here long enough to leave something. Not the object itself, but what the object had been accumulating. That doesn't always go away with the object. What do you mean it stays? I asked. That the bathroom mirror started to absorb something that wasn't its own, Lucia said. Mirrors are permeable in a way that isn't well understood. The antique mirror you had here had decades of accumulation. Part of that migrated. And what's in the bathroom mirror now? Lucia looked directly at me. Something that learned to imitate, she said. It's not the same entity that was in the large mirror, if there was anything with that definition in the large mirror. It's more like an echo, an imperfect copy that learned a behavior. What behavior? Looking at you, she said. Studying you. Mirrors that work like this first learn to observe and then to reproduce. What you saw, that smile, was a reproduction. Something it saw in you and repeated at the wrong moment. I stayed silent, processing that. How is it resolved? Lucia and Carmen exchanged a glance. The bathroom mirror has to be thrown away, Lucia said. And the apartment needs to be cleaned, especially the study. It's nothing complicated, but it has to be done with intention, with a clear awareness of what is being done and why. We did it that afternoon. Lucia was the one who brought the plants we needed, the incense, the salt water. I followed her through each room of the apartment, paying attention to her instructions, doing what she asked. The bathroom mirror ended up in the street container before it got dark. When Lucia and Carmen left, the apartment felt different, not in a dramatic way. There was no obvious transformation. It was more subtle than that. It was the difference between the air of a room that has been closed for a long time and the air of the same room when you open the windows. The same room, but the weight of the atmosphere lightened. I bought a new mirror for the bathroom, a small modern one, made of glass with no history. I installed it myself and looked at it for a long minute before deciding it was just a mirror. That was 2 years ago. I haven't seen anything in any reflection that wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be. I haven't felt that sense of dissonance again, that fraction of a second more before the reflection responds. What has changed, and this is what I don't know how to explain entirely, is my relationship with mirrors. I'm not exactly afraid of them, but I no longer treat them with the automatic indifference I had before. I look at them with an attention that didn't exist in me until that year. I look at them and sometimes I wonder what exactly a mirror does when no one is looking at it. I still don't have an answer for that, and I think I prefer not to find it. End of Isabel's testimony. She authorized me to share her story in the hope that if someone else has noticed something strange in an old mirror, they know they are not imagining things. If something similar has ever happened to you, or if you have an object in your house with a story you don't quite understand, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you tonight, subscribe. There are many more waiting. Sleep well. We'll hear from each other soon. What I am about to narrate now was sent to me by a follower named Sofia from Peru, and it is different from most of the stories I receive because it does not take place in an old house or an abandoned place. It happens right in the city in a completely normal office job during a night shift. Sofia is 34 years old and worked for 8 months as an operator in an emergency call center. She tells me that she quit without notice, without a letter, without explanation. She just didn't come back. And what made her leave had to do with a call she received one early morning in October, and with what she discovered about that call the next day. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. We publish often. Now, let's go with what happened to Sofia. I started working at the emergency call center in February, and by October I already knew the job well enough to have lost the initial fear. It is important that you understand this, because what happened was not the result of a nervous or suggestible person. By the time that early morning arrived, I had already taken calls about serious accidents, fires, and people in crisis. I had already developed that shield that one builds over the months to be able to do that job without breaking down. It was practice, it was efficient, and I was proud of that. My name is Sofia. I was 31 years old at that time. I studied communications, ended up working in the call center out of economic necessity, and discovered that I was good at it. I had a clear voice, precise diction, and the ability to stay calm while coordinating resources. The night supervisor, a man named Rodrigo, had told me in my 6-month evaluation that I was one of his best operators. That mattered to me. The night shift was from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. It wasn't anyone's favorite shift, but it paid 20% more. And at that point in my life, money mattered more than sleep. I adapted to the schedule, just as one ends up adapting to almost everything. The night of October 16th started like all the others. I arrived at 10:40, took over from the operator who was leaving, checked the board of available resources, put on my headphones, and started. The first hours were active. A traffic accident near downtown, 2 noise complaints that resolved themselves, a medical emergency in an apartment building that required coordination with healthcare staff. The kind of night that keeps you alert, but doesn't exhaust you. By 2 in the morning, the flow had calmed down. Rodrigo was in the supervision room at the back, visible through the glass. The other 2 operators on shift, Javier and Paula, were at their posts with expressions of those who have spent too many hours in front of a screen. The room had that particular silence of working early mornings, constant white lights, the soft hum of the equipment, the artificial chill of the air conditioning that Rodrigo always set too high. At 2:17 in the morning, the call came in. There was nothing unusual about how it arrived. The tone in my earpiece, the number appearing on my screen, the line opening. All normal. "Emergency center, what is your situation?" I said. Silence. Not a silence of a disconnected line, but the silence of someone who is there, who is listening, who has called but is not speaking. This happens with some frequency, especially in crisis calls where the person needs a few seconds before they can articulate something. "I'm here," I said, in the tone we use for those cases, calm and without urgency. "Take the time you need." A moment. Then, very softly, almost inaudible, a voice. It was a woman's voice. Or at least that was what I registered in that first instant, although in the second that followed I was not so sure. It had something in the texture that didn't quite fit into any clear category. It was old but not fragile. It was soft, but with something beneath the softness that was something completely different. She said 3 words. "I see you now." Nothing more. Just that. I paused for a second without responding, which was not my habit. The protocol for silent or incoherent calls was clear. Keep the line open, try to obtain location. Do not hang up until there is enough information to assess whether it was necessary to send resources. "Can you tell me where you are?" I asked, following the protocol. Silence. "Do you need help?" Silence. And then the voice again, exactly the same 3 words. "I see you now." I felt something at that moment that I am not going to dramatize but also will not minimize. A physical discomfort, a slight tightening in the stomach, the same feeling one has when something doesn't fit but doesn't yet know what is wrong. "Do you have any emergency to report?" I asked. The line went dead. I documented the call in the system. Duration, time, originating number, content. The originating number was the first thing that caught my attention when I wrote it down. although I didn't fully process it at that moment. The number had a strange format, with more digits than usual, which the system accepted without marking an error, but that I didn't recognize as any regional prefix I knew. I mentioned the call to Rodrigo during the next break. Rodrigo checked the record on his screen, frowned slightly, and said it was probably a wrong number or someone in an altered state who hung up before being able to speak. He told me that if the same number called again, I should escalate it immediately. It didn't call back that night. I finished my shift at 7, took the bus home, slept until 3 in the afternoon as was my custom, and upon waking the call was already in that mental compartment where one keeps the strange things from work that have no clear explanation but also don't require more attention. I stored it there and continued with my week. 4 nights later, on October 20th, it called again. I knew it before the call connected completely, which makes no logical sense, and yet it was so. Something in the way the tone sounded in my headset, some imperceptible difference in sound quality, made me know before seeing the number on the screen that it was the same call. I saw the number. It was the same, the one with the extra digits, the one in the format I didn't recognize. Emergency center, what is your situation? Silence. I waited 10 seconds before speaking again. The room around me remained the same, Javier and Paula at their posts, Rodrigo in the supervision room at the back, the white lights, the hum of the equipment. I'm listening, I said. The voice came through without pause this time, the same words, the exact same tone, as if it were a recording. I can see you now. Who is speaking? I asked, deviating from protocol. Silence. What is your name? Silence. And then something different from the previous times. Something that made me instinctively take off my headphones. The same automatic gesture one makes when a sound is too loud. It wasn't a loud sound. It was something else. A sound that shouldn't exist on a phone call. It was as if someone was breathing, yes, but the breathing had something superimposed, something beneath it, like another frequency of sound that the phone wasn't designed to transmit but somehow was transmitting anyway. He ended the call before I could do anything else. I was left with the headphones in my hand, looking at the screen where the number had disappeared from the active log. I went to look for Rodrigo. I told him about the second call with all the details, including the discomfort that sound at the end had caused me. Rodrigo listened attentively, checked the record, and frowned more intensely than the first time. This number, he said, pointing at the screen, I'm going to try to trace it. Does it have the correct format for the system? The system accepted it, Rodrigo said, but technically it shouldn't have accepted it. It has 4 extra digits for any national or international numbering format that I know of. He spent a few minutes searching in the system and in additional databases. In the end, he looked up. There is no record of this number in any active database, he said. This technically cannot exist. And yet it called twice? And yet it called twice, Rodrigo confirmed. She told me she was going to report it to the technical team in the morning, that it was probably a system error or some kind of interference generating a false number. She told me that if I called back I shouldn't hang up, that I should keep the line open for as long as I could. That week I slept poorly, not dramatically, not with nightmares or anything I could pinpoint precisely. I slept, but the sleep was not restful. I would wake up with a fatigue that didn't correspond to the hours slept, with a vague feeling of having been somewhere during those hours that wasn't exactly rest. On Thursday I spoke with Paula, the other operator on the night shift. I didn't tell her about the calls. I just asked her in general if she had ever received calls that she couldn't trace, numbers that the system accepted but that didn't exist in any database. Paula looked at me for a moment before responding. Once, she said, about a year ago. What happened? Nothing, she said. The technical team said it was a system error and they closed it. But the call was strange. How strange? Paula hesitated. The person who called knew my name, she said. I didn't give it to them. They just asked for me. They asked, "Is Paula there?" And when I said it was me, they hung up. I was left in silence processing that. And nothing else happened? I asked. No, Paula said. They never called again. But I had some strange days afterward. A feeling that someone was watching me, that kind of thing. It passed. I didn't ask her more. The third call came on October 25th, a Tuesday, at 1:48 in the morning. This time I was prepared. in the sense that I had consciously decided to keep the line open and gather everything I could. I had the secondary recorder active, something that the protocol allowed for calls under investigation, and I had Rodrigo alerted that if the number appeared again, I would signal him immediately. When the tone rang, I looked towards the supervision room. Rodrigo was looking at his screen with a concentrated expression. He had seen it too. I accepted the call. Emergency center. Silence. I mentally counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. At 5 seconds, the voice. "I can see you." "Where are you seeing me from?" I asked, deliberately direct. Silence. "Are you in a place where you need help?" "Nothing." "Can you give me an address?" And then something happened that was not in either of the 2 previous calls. The voice answered my question, not with an address, with something else. "You already know where I am," he said. "My name." He said my name before that phrase, before the "you," which transformed the entire sentence into something that hit me physically in the chest with an efficiency I didn't expect. "How does he know my name?" I asked. The breathing, the sound of breath underneath, louder this time, clearer, that frequency that shouldn't exist on a phone line. "Sophia," the voice said, "just my name, just that." And he hung up. I took off my headphones. My hands were completely still, which I noticed because I would have expected them to tremble and they didn't. It was a physical calm that didn't correspond to what I felt inside, where something had tightened very hard and wouldn't quite loosen. Rodrigo came out of the supervision room and came straight to my desk. "I heard it," he said. "He recorded everything. He knows my name." "Yes." "Rodrigo, how can he know my name?" Rodrigo did not respond immediately. He kept staring at the screen where the number had disappeared again from the active log. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Because it's not the first time this number has called this center." I looked at him. "What?" "I searched the file when you reported the second call," Rodrigo said. "This number, or something that the system records identically to this number, appears in the history. Old calls, very old." "How old?" Rodrigo looked at me. "The oldest record I found is from 19 years ago," he said. "This center has been in operation for 21 years. I processed that." "And what did the record from 19 years ago say?" "The same as now," Rodrigo said, in a voice that had lowered in volume without him seeming to notice. "Brief call. No traceable location information. Audio content described as incomprehensible in the records from that time because it wasn't transcribed then. And the number with the same impossible format." "How many times does it appear in the history?" 4 times in 19 years, he said. "Always with months of difference between calls, always on the night shift, always answered by a different operator." "What happened to the operators who answered it before?" Rodrigo took a while to respond. 2 resigned within the month following the call, he said. "I have no follow-up on the 3rd because the personnel file from that time is incomplete." "And the 4th?" "The 4th is me," Rodrigo said. I stayed looking at him. 7 years ago, he said. "It was new then. I was an operator, not a supervisor. I took a call from this number." He said the same words. He mentioned my name. "And the next day when I went to report it, they told me that the record showed I had never taken that call. That the records from that night had no entry with that number. And now it does appear?" "Now it does appear," Rodrigo said. "This time I recorded it before he arrived. We have the audio. We have the record. It's not going to disappear from the system." "What do you think it is?" I asked. Rodrigo took a moment to respond. He was a practical, technical man, one of those who found explanations before invoking mysteries. "I don't know," he finally said, and in his voice there was something I hadn't heard before in the months I had been working with him. Something that resembled, without being exactly, adult fear that was well contained. But what I do know is that in the 2 documented cases where the operator continued to take calls after the contact, the calls continued, more frequently, and with more information. "What kind of information?" "Things they shouldn't know," he said. "Personal things, about the operator's life outside of this place." I fell silent. "What did those operators do?" "One ignored the calls for 3 weeks until he resigned," Rodrigo said. "The other tried to answer them. Tried to trace the origin, tried to understand what it was. That's the one I don't have complete follow-up on." What does it mean to not have complete follow-up? That the personnel file ends abruptly, Rodrigo said. No resignation letter, no documented dismissal. He just stops appearing. I finished my shift that night in silence. I did my job, answered the calls that came in, documented everything correctly. But a part of my mind was elsewhere, processing what Rodrigo had told me, piecing together and breaking down the information in search of an interpretation that made sense in terms I could handle. I didn't find it. On the bus ride home, as the city dawned around me with that gray and cold light of October mornings in Lima, I thought about the words of the voice. I see you already. You already know where I am. And my name, said with a familiarity I hadn't earned, that no one had given him. I thought about what it meant for something to be able to see you without you being able to see it. That it knew your name without you having given it. That it called from a number that didn't exist in any database of the known world, but that the system accepted anyway, as if the system recognized something that the humans in charge of it did not recognize. That afternoon, instead of sleeping, I called my mother. I didn't tell him anything about the calls. We only talked about normal things for half an hour, about my brother, about plans for the end-of-year parties, about a movie my mother had seen and wanted to recommend to me. Real, concrete things, anchored in the world I knew and in which I moved with confidence. When I hung up, I felt somewhat better. But that night, before heading out for my shift, I checked the message group of the night shift operators, where we sometimes shared practical notices about work. There was a message from Rodrigo sent 2 hours earlier. It said, "The technical team reviewed the audio from last night. They say there is a problem with the recording, that there is interference in the frequencies that they cannot explain, and that the file is corrupted. There is nothing recoverable." Below that message, sent an hour later, there was another from Rodrigo. The call log also disappeared from the system. I stared at the phone for a good while. Then I wrote a message in the group saying that I wouldn't be able to attend the shift that night for personal reasons. I expressed my regret and mentioned that I would notify about the following days. The next day, I submitted my resignation in writing, without providing detailed reasons, citing personal reasons. The human resources process went smoothly. My human resources supervisor, who was not Rodrigo but a person from the day shift, wished me luck and told me that I had been a good employee. I never returned. 3 years have passed. I now work at a telecommunications company, daytime shift, no emergency calls, no calls from impossible numbers. I sleep at night. My life is completely normal in every verifiable sense. But there is something I haven't been able to resolve, that lives in some corner of my mind that I occasionally peek into unwillingly and quickly pull away from. If the voice said I see you now, and if what it said is true, then it doesn't matter that I change jobs. It doesn't matter that I stop taking those calls. Because what it sees does not see the operator on duty. It sees Sophia. And Sophia is still me. In any job, in any shift, in any place I am. I don't know what called those nights in October. I don't know where it was calling from, nor how it had my name, nor why it chooses certain people and not others, nor what would have happened if I had continued answering its calls. There are things for which I have no answer, and I have learned to live with that. What I do have is a rule, simple and absolute, that I apply in my life without exception since that early morning. If something that shouldn't know your name says it, don't confirm that you heard it. Don't respond. Don't let them know that it arrived. End of Sophia's testimony. She wrote to me that Rodrigo also resigned a few weeks after she left, although she didn't give details about why. She says they haven't spoken since then, and that she prefers it to stay that way. There are experiences that one shares better with strangers than with those who live them by their side, because the stranger can listen without carrying the weight of having lived it too. If you have a story that you've kept hidden, whether it's about work, childhood, a place, or a person you could never explain, write to me. I love receiving them. And if you're coming to the channel for the first time, there are many more stories waiting. Take care a lot tonight. I want to start this story by warning you about something. The person who sent it to me does not believe in ghosts, or at least he didn't believe before moving into the Monte Cristo building. His name is Andres. He is 41 years old, works as a civil engineer, and wrote to me from Mexico City a couple of months ago with a tale that I reread 3 times before deciding to narrate it. If you are listening to this and have ever felt that a place has something that cannot be explained with logic, I would like you to tell me about it in the comments. That is exactly what Andres felt, and he is the last person you would expect to say something like that. Make yourself comfortable. What follows happened during the 4 months that Andres lived on the 12th floor of that building, and neither of us knows for sure what was inhabiting there with him. I am an engineer. I say this from the beginning because it matters to understand what kind of mind I process things with. I spent 5 years studying structures, calculus, and material strength. My job consists of visiting construction sites, reviewing numbers, identifying failures in systems that other people do not see. I am, in the most literal sense of the word, someone trained to find rational explanations for problems. What happens to a building always has a concrete cause: poor design, deficient materials, construction errors, wear over time. There is never a mystery in buildings. There are only data that have not yet been read well. With that mindset, I arrived at Monte Cristo. I moved there in January. I had just finished a long contract in Guadalajara and had secured a new job in the city. Elena, my wife, would stay in Guadalajara for 3 more months, finishing her own matters before joining me. I needed a temporary apartment, something furnished, central, and uncomplicated. El Monte Cristo met all those requirements. It was a building from the 60s in the Colonia Narvarte, 15 stories, gray stone facade, electric doorman, and a decent view from the upper floors. The price was reasonable for the area, which should have made me wonder why, but I didn't ask. The apartment was 12B, 4th floor from the top. Living room, dining room, 1 bedroom, small kitchen, and a bathroom with tiles from the 80s that nobody had changed. It was clean, furnished with basic functional things. The lady from the agency handed me the keys on a Tuesday afternoon and told me that the building manager was named Don Prospero and lived on the ground floor, and that any problem I had I could knock on his door. She gave me a 4-month contract. I signed. I carried up my suitcases. I poured myself a glass of tap water and looked out the living room window at the rooftops of the neighborhood. The first night I slept well. The second night too. On the third night at 2:15 in the morning, according to the phone I was charging on the nightstand, I was awakened by a sound. It was a thud. Dry, singular, coming from the bedroom wall. The wall that faced the exterior hallway of the building, not the neighboring apartment. I stayed listening in the darkness for several minutes. Nothing else. I told myself it could have been anything. Contraction of materials due to the nighttime temperature change, something that fell in another apartment and resonated through the structure, the elevator making some maneuver. Old building speak. Any engineer knows that. I turned over and fell asleep. Several days went by without anything happening. I was settling into the routine of the new city. Early office, late return, solitary dinner, call with Elena before sleeping. The apartment was fine. A bit cold at night, noticeably colder than what the thermostat justified, but I attributed it to the poor insulation of the old building. There were drafts that I couldn't pinpoint precisely, which was a bit strange since all the windows closed well, but it wasn't something that kept me awake at night. I met Don Prospero a week after I arrived. I found him in the lobby sweeping with a calmness that seemed to have been cultivated over decades. He was a man in his 70s, short, with copper-colored skin and huge hands. He greeted me with a nod and asked if I had been given everything necessary for the apartment. I told him yes. He asked if there was any problem. I said none, just that the room got quite cold at night. He nodded slowly. He said, "Everyone says the same about 12B." I asked him if there was a particular reason. He looked at me in a way that was hard to describe, as if he were assessing how much he wanted to tell me. Then he said, "The building is old. There are places like that." And he continued sweeping. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first event that really made me feel something was the one with the mirror. 3 weeks had passed since my arrival. It was a Friday night and I had come home late from work, exhausted. I took a shower, dried off, and as I left the bathroom I passed by the full-length mirror that was in the hallway between the bathroom and the bedroom. I caught a glimpse of myself for a second just passing by. And in that second, in that fraction of a second before I looked away, I saw something behind me in the reflection. It was small, about the height of an 8 or 10-year-old child. It was about 3 meters behind me at the point where the hallway turned toward the living room, and by the time I turned around, there was nothing. I stood in that hallway for a time I couldn't calculate. Then I went to the living room. I checked behind the sofa, behind the curtains, under the dining table. Nothing. I went back to the bathroom and checked there too. Nothing. I told myself it had been an optical illusion, the visual fatigue of a long day, perhaps the reflection of something in the partially open window of the living room. Mirrors and moving objects create all kinds of illusions. I know this because there are studies about it. I went to sleep convinced that there was nothing, but I didn't sleep well that night. I had the feeling for hours that someone was standing next to my bed. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. It was just a pressure on my consciousness, like when you know someone is watching you in a public space and you turn around to confirm it. That same certainty, held for hours, without confirmation and without rest. The next day I called Elena and didn't tell her anything. I don't know exactly why. I suppose I didn't want to sound like someone who, in their first month of living alone, is already seeing things in the mirrors. During the following week, 3 small things happened that I cataloged at the time as unrelated. The first, I found the bedroom door closed when I got home from work one Wednesday. I never closed that door. There was no reason to do so. I lived alone. I tried to remember if I had closed it in the morning without thinking. I didn't remember, neither one way nor the other. The second, on Wednesday night, before falling asleep, I heard from somewhere in the apartment, faint but perfectly audible, what sounded like a child's voice humming, not a recognizable melody, just repeated irregular notes like someone humming without intention. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. I got up and walked around the apartment. The sound did not repeat. I checked if any neighbor could have produced it. The apartment above was unoccupied according to what Don Prospero had told me, and the one below was inhabited by an older couple who never made noise. The third, on Friday, while preparing breakfast, I found on the kitchen countertop a mark that hadn't been there the night before. It was a small imprint, like that of a child's hand, in the fine dust that accumulates on kitchen surfaces even when one cleans them. The fingers were short and spread apart. I took a photo of it with my phone. I don't know why I photographed it. I suppose some part of me already knew I wanted to have a record of something, even though I didn't yet know what it was. That weekend, I went down to talk to Don Prospero. I found him in his room on the ground floor, a small room with a TV on, and the smell of reheated coffee. I told him I wanted to ask him something about the apartment. He gestured for me to sit down. I offered him coffee. I accepted even though I didn't feel like having coffee. I asked him directly if anything had happened in 12B, any prior issues, any previous tenant who had had problems. Don Prospero took his cup. He looked at the turned-off television for a moment. Then he said to me, "What did you see?" I described to him the reflection in the mirror, the humming, the footprint. He listened without interrupting me. When I finished, he nodded as if nothing I had told him surprised him. He then told me that the 12B had a history that the real estate agency did not mention because the real estate agency never mentioned it in any of its buildings. 17 years ago, a 9-year-old boy named Tomas had died in that apartment. Not by violence, Don Prospero clarified before I could ask. It was an illness. One of those fast-moving diseases that progress before doctors understand what they are seeing. The boy had lived there with his mother, and he had spent the last weeks of his life in that bedroom, in that bed, looking at that ceiling. I asked him if the mother was still in the building. Don Prospero said no. He said the woman had left 2 months after the child's death and that he never heard from her again. He said that since then, the apartment had a high turnover of tenants. No one stayed more than a few months. When I asked him why, he told me that most said the apartment felt uncomfortable, that they didn't feel alone, that they didn't sleep well. Only one, he said, had been more specific. He had said he saw a child standing in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. That man left the next day. I remained silent for a while after hearing that. Then I asked Don Prospero what he thought, if he believed there was something in the apartment. He looked at me with those eyes that I already knew were assessing how much to say. And he said, "What I think doesn't matter. What matters is what you are going to do." I returned to the apartment and sat in the living room with the light on even though it was daytime. I analyzed everything with the methodology I use for work problems, known facts, possible hypotheses, available evidence. The facts. A child had died in that apartment. I had seen something in the mirror, heard something, found a footprint. Rational hypotheses. Fatigue, suggestibility, dust in an accidental configuration, Irrational hypotheses. The child was still there somehow. I did not believe in the second hypothesis, but I also could not completely refute what I had seen and heard. I decided to stay, for two reasons. One, because changing apartments involved a logistics that I did not have time to manage. And two, because something in me, that engineer's instinct that needs to understand systems before abandoning them, wanted to know more. What followed in the days after was a gradual escalation that, looking back, had a logic that I could not see at the time. First, it was the temperature. The nighttime cold in the bedroom intensified to the point that I could no longer attribute it to insulation. I ended up buying a second comforter, and still, I would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning with a feeling of cold in my hands and face that the comforter did not cover. It was a localized cold, as if a window were open right above me, even though there was no window in that position. Then it was the smell. It appeared and disappeared without pattern. It was something I took days to identify. The smell of a hospital, that specific scent of disinfectant and plastic and something else beneath it that one associates with places where people are sick. It wasn't strong. It was barely perceptible, as if someone had brought it there on their clothes a long time ago and the materials had absorbed it and were slowly releasing it. I opened the windows. The smell always returned. And then, on the third night after speaking with Don Prospero, I saw it. It was 3:20 in the morning. I had woken up, as always, because of the cold. I was lying on my side looking towards the bedroom door, which was slightly open. And in the frame of that door, with the little light that came in from the hallway, I saw the silhouette of a child. He was standing still with his arms pressed against his body. I couldn't see his features in the darkness. He was small, about the height that Don Prospero had described as that of a 9-year-old child. He wasn't moving. He was just there. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I think the body, in those extreme situations, chooses immobility over anything else. I stayed exactly in the position I was in, looking at that silhouette. And the silhouette was looking at me, or so I assumed because I couldn't see his eyes. It lasted, I estimate, about 2 minutes. Then, without me doing anything, without anything changing in the environment, the silhouette was no longer there. It didn't disappear dramatically. It didn't fade away or move. One moment it was there and the next it wasn't, like when you stop seeing something because the light changes slightly. I stayed awake until dawn. In the morning I called Elena. This time I did tell her. I told her everything from the mirror to that night. She listened to me in silence throughout the narration. When I finished, she said to me with a calmness I appreciated, "Andres, what do you think it is?" I told her I didn't know. She said, "Do you think it wants to harm you?" I thought about that. I replied that no, I hadn't felt that way at any moment. That it was rather a presence. Something that was there and knew that I was there too. Elena was silent for a moment and then said, "Then maybe it just is." I didn't know what to do with that, but I couldn't argue against it either. The following days I spent in a constant state of alertness that was exhausting. I looked at every corner before entering each room. I checked the doorframe before falling asleep. Nothing. The boy, or whatever it was, did not reappear visibly for almost 2 weeks, but it was still there. I knew it by the cold, by the smell that came and went, by a feeling I learned to recognize during those weeks. A kind of weight in the air, very subtle, that changed the quality of the silence inside the apartment. Empty spaces sound different when they are only empty of people. This one sounded different in another way. I made a decision that at that moment seemed reasonable to me, and that now I don't know how to evaluate. I decided to talk to it. It was a Thursday night. I was sitting in the living room with the phone in my hand, about to call Elena, when I felt the weight in the air that I already knew. I stayed still, and in a low voice, without getting up from the sofa, I said, "I know you're there." Silence. I said, "I'm not going to do anything to you. You don't have to hide." Nothing for a while. Then from the bedroom, that humming, the same irregular notes from the previous weeks. It lasted longer this time, maybe 2 minutes. And there was something in the irregularity of those notes that I began to hear differently. Not like a formless melody, but like someone humming what they remember of something. What remains of a song when one can no longer reconstruct it completely. I said, "It's okay." I don't really know what I meant by that. I guess it was the only thing that came out. The humming stopped. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. What happened during the following month is difficult to narrate in a linear way because it was not linear. It was a coexistence. That is the word that best describes it. The boy, Tomas, was still there, and I was still there, and we found a kind of coexistence that I had not planned and did not know how to name. The cold continued at night, but I was getting used to it. The smell of the hospital appeared and disappeared, but it no longer generated the same visceral reaction in me. Every few days I found something slightly moved from its place. A glass on a different shelf. A chair turned a few degrees. My coat on the hook on the right instead of the left where I always left it. I saw him 3 more times during that month. The first time was in the kitchen at night, and it was very brief. Just a second before I turned on the light and the space was left empty. The second time was in the living room, sitting on the floor next to the turned-off television, in the posture of someone looking at something that isn't there. It lasted longer this time. Almost a minute. He didn't move. Neither did I. Then he left. The third time was different. I was reading in the armchair in the living room late, with a lamp on. I felt the change in the air and looked towards the hallway. The boy was there, standing as always, but this time I had more light to see him than before. And this time I could see something I hadn't been able to see before. His face. It was the face of a child. Dark eyes. An expression that was neither fear nor sadness, but something that resembled concentration, like someone making a sustained effort. He was looking directly at me. I looked back at him, and in that exchange of glances, which lasted perhaps 20 seconds, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not terror, something more like sorrow. A huge sorrow with no clear recipient that rose from somewhere in my chest and stayed there. The boy extended an arm, not towards me but to the side, towards the hallway wall. And then, like the previous times, he was no longer there. I sat with the closed book in my hands for a long while. Then I got up and went to the point on the wall where he had pointed. It was a stretch of wall between the hallway and the entrance to the bedroom, without pictures or furniture. The paint was slightly darker in a rectangle about 40 centimeters by 30, as if something had been hanging there for a long time and the rest of the wall had yellowed around it. I went to see Don Prospero the next day. I described to him what I had seen, the gesture, the wall, the mark. I asked him if he knew what had been hanging there. Don Prospero looked at me for a moment before saying, "The mother had a picture of the boy there, a large framed photograph. She took it when she left." He paused. It was the only photo in the whole apartment. I didn't know what to do with that information. I still don't know what to do with it. I don't know if the boy was pointing to the photo because he missed it, because he wanted me to know who he was, or for some other reason that I couldn't grasp. I don't know if what I saw was the spirit of Tomas, an echo of something that happened there 17 years ago, a construction of my own mind operating under weeks of sleep deprivation and suggestibility, or something completely different that none of those categories describe well. What I do know is what happened the last night. Elena arrived in the city 3 weeks earlier than planned because her work was resolved sooner than expected. She called to let me know and arrived the next day with her suitcases. I welcomed her with a mix of relief and something I can only describe as worry, although I wasn't clear about whom it was for. That first night, the two of them slept in the bedroom of 12B. Elena fell asleep quickly as she always does. I took longer. At 2 in the morning, I woke up, as always, from the cold. I glanced at the doorframe by reflex. The boy was there. But something was different. His posture was not like the previous times. He was slightly hunched over, with his head tilted, and although I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, I had the impression that he was looking at Elena sleeping instead of looking at me. And something in that image, something I can't rationally justify but that was absolutely physical in my body, made me feel an urgency I had never felt before. In a very low voice, almost soundless, I said to him, "No." There was a pause that seemed long. Then the cold disappeared, not gradually, all at once, as if someone had closed a window. The air in the room normalized in seconds. The doorframe was empty. That was 2 months ago. Since that night, nothing. The apartment feels different. Not completely empty, or maybe it is. And I have gotten so used to the weight in the air that its absence is what now feels strange. Elena hasn't seen or heard anything. When I asked her if she had noticed anything odd in the apartment, she said no, that it seemed a bit cold to her, but nothing more. We ended the lease and moved to another place 3 weeks ago. I don't know if what happened in 12B has an explanation. I don't know if Tomas is still there, waiting for something that never comes, or if he somehow left. I don't know if what I saw that last night was dangerous, or if I misinterpreted something that was completely harmless. What I do know is that I am an engineer. I spend my days measuring structures and calculating loads and predicting how systems behave under pressure. And I have no framework, no professional tools, no methodology that allows me to explain what happened in that apartment during those 4 months. And that, the lack of explanation, is perhaps what I struggle with the most. That, and the image of that child watching my wife sleep, and me telling him no, and for him to listen to me. That's all Andres wrote to me. He told me at the end of the message that he had never told this complete story, not even to Elena, and that writing it took him 3 days. What stayed with me the most was that last image, an engineer, a man who built his life on logic, negotiating in the dark with something that his training has no way of naming. If you've ever lived in a place that felt inhabited in a way you couldn't explain, I would love for you to tell me about it. The comments are there for that. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, you know where to stay. Take care, rest well. We'll hear from each other in the next story.